The year is 1208, in the sun-drenched valleys of southern France. A civilization unlike any other in medieval Europe stands on the precipice of annihilation. Here, where the Mediterranean breeze carries the scent of lavender across ancient Roman roads, where troubadours sing of courtly love in castle halls adorned with Arabic mathematics and Jewish philosophy, a different dream of Christianity has taken root. This is the story of the Albigensian Crusade, 1 years of holy war that would reshape France forever, crush a millennium-old culture, and demonstrate that the medieval church would enforce unity through fire and sword. The Languedoc of 1208 was a world apart from the feudal darkness that gripped much of Europe. Its cities thrived on trade with the Islamic world and Byzantium. Its courts patronized learning that the northern kingdoms had forgotten. Its laws, derived from Roman jurisprudence rather than Germanic custom, granted unprecedented freedoms to merchants and artisans. Women could inherit property, divorce their husbands, and participate in religious life as equals. Jews lived openly and prosperously, serving as physicians, scholars, and financial advisors to Christian nobles. Muslims from Al-Andalus found refuge and respect in its universities. But it was the religious diversity of this land that would prove its downfall. For here, among the olive groves and vine-covered hills, a Christian heresy had not merely survived, but flourished. Its adherents called themselves simply good Christians or good men and good women. History would know them as the Cathars, the pure ones, and their faith would challenge everything the medieval Catholic Church held sacred. Chapter 1. The Serpent in the Sun. To understand the Albigensian Crusade, one must first understand the profound theological revolution that Catharism represented. This was not merely another dispute over papal authority or clerical corruption. The Cathars had reimagined the very nature of God, creation, and salvation in ways that struck at the foundation of medieval Christianity. Historian Dr. Claire Taylor, the Cathars, believed that two gods ruled the universe: a good God who created the spiritual realm of heaven and souls, and an evil God, Rex Mundi, the king of the world, who created this material prison we call Earth. This wasn't just heresy. It was a complete inversion of Christian cosmology. The Cathar creation myth told of a cosmic war between these two divine powers. The good God had created a perfect spiritual realm populated by pure souls living in eternal harmony. But the evil God, sometimes identified with Satan, sometimes with the wrathful deity of the Old Testament, had rebelled against this perfection. Through cunning and force, he had lured souls from their heavenly home and trapped them in material bodies within his own corrupt creation. This earth, with all its beauty and horror, was thus a prison. Every mountain and river, every flower and beast, every human body was the work of the evil God. The material world was not fallenate, was fundamentally and irredeemably evil. The goal of human existence was not to redeem the world, but to escape it entirely. Religious Studies Professor Dr. Bernard Hamilton. What made Catharism so dangerous to Orthodox Christianity was its complete rejection of the material world. If the body is evil, then Christ couldn't have had a real body. If matter is evil, then the Eucharist is meaningless. The entire sacramental system of the Catholic Church became not just wrong, but demonic. Indeed, the Cathars embraced what theologians call Docetism, the belief that Jesus Christ was not truly incarnate, but only appeared to take human form. He was a spiritual being, an angel sent by the good God to teach imprisoned souls the secret, knowledge of their divine origin, and the path to escape. His crucifixion and resurrection were thus illusory divine theater, performed to reveal spiritual truths to those capable of understanding. This Christology demolished the Catholic doctrine of redemption. If Christ had not truly suffered and died, then his sacrifice could not have saved humanity from sin. If he had not truly risen from the dead, then the promise of bodily resurrection was false. The Cathars taught instead that salvation came through knowledge and spiritual purification, culminating in the reception of their single sacrament, the consolamentum. The consolamentum was a baptism of the Holy Spirit, transmitted through the laying on of hands by those who had already received it. Unlike Catholic baptism, which could be performed by any priest and was typically given to infants, the consolamentum required extensive preparation and was usually reserved for adults approaching death or those ready to commit to lives of absolute spiritual rigor. Medieval historian Dr. Malcolm Barber, the consolamentum created a two-tiered religious society. The vast majority remained credentist believers who supported the faith but lived relatively normal lives. Above them stood the perfects, men and women who had received the consolamentum and were considered to be living saints. The credentes formed the broad base of Cathar society. They could marry, own property, engage in commerce, and even bear arms. They were expected to attend Cathar religious services, support the perfects financially, and receive the consolamentum on their deathbeds to ensure salvation. Many credentes lived their entire lives as apparent Catholics, attending Mass and receiving Catholic sacraments, while secretly believing in Cathar doctrine. The perfects, by contrast, lived lives of extraordinary asceticism that rivaled those of the most rigorous Catholic monks. Upon receiving the consolamentum, they committed themselves to absolute chastity, renouncing not only sexual relations but even casual physical contact with members of the opposite sex. They became strict vegetarians, avoiding not only meat but also eggs, milk, and cheese, any food that resulted from animal procreation, which they saw as the evil god's method of perpetuating material existence. Historian Dr. Peter Biller, the perfects were the walking embodiment of Cathar theology. By rejecting marriage, procreation, and the taking of animal life, they were refusing to participate in Rex Mundi's creation. They lived as if they were already partially free from the material world. The perfects owned no personal property and survived entirely on the donations of credentes. They traveled constantly, moving from town to town in pairs, preaching and administering the consolamentum to dying believers. Despite their ascetic lifestyle, they were highly educated and articulate, capable of debating Catholic theologians and winning converts through reasoned argument as much as personal example. Both male and female perfects held equal authority within the Cathar Church. Women could preach, administer sacraments, and lead religious communities, privileges denied them in Catholic Christianity. This gender equality attracted many noble women to the faith, including sisters and daughters of the most powerful lords in the Languedoc. The Cathar rejection of Catholic authority was absolute. They denied the validity of the Catholic priesthood, arguing that an evil institution could not mediate between souls and the good God. They rejected all Catholic sacraments except baptism, which they claimed to perform in its original spiritual form. They refused to swear oaths, viewing them as expressions of worldly power that bound souls more tightly to Rex Mundi's realm. Most shocking of all to Catholic sensibilities, the Cathars rejected the veneration of the cross. To them, the cross was an instrument of torture created by the evil god as servants to torment the spiritual Christ. Worshipping it was tantamount to devil worship. They similarly rejected the veneration of saints and relics, seeing them as idolatrous distractions from the pure worship of the good God. This theological radicalism might have remained a curiosity confined to remote mountain villages, but Catharism had found fertile ground among the educated urban classes and nobility of the Languedoc. By 1200, entire cities had Cathar majorities. Noble families sent their daughters to Cathar convents and their sons to study with perfect theologians. The faith had evolved its own infrastructure of schools, hospitals, and financial networks that rivaled those of the Catholic Church. Historian Dr. Joseph Strayer, what made Catharism truly dangerous was not just its theology, but its success. This wasn't a peasant revolt or a movement of the dispossessed. It was winning over the very people who were supposed to be the pillars of Catholic society: the educated, the wealthy, the powerful. The political structure of the Languedoc facilitated this religious revolution. Unlike northern France, where the Capetian kings were steadily consolidating royal authority, The south remained a complex patchwork of virtually independent counties and viscounties. Toulouse, theoretically the most powerful lord in the region, in practice controlled little beyond his immediate domain. Real power lay with a network of lesser nobles who owed him only nominal allegiance. This fragmented authority created spaces where religious diversity could flourish. A count might be Catholic, but his vassals could be Cathars. And their competing claims created a delicate balance that discouraged religious persecution. Add to this the influence of the Crown of Aragon, whose territories extended north of the Pyrenees, and whose kings were more concerned with containing French expansion than enforcing religious orthodoxy, and you had a political environment unlike anywhere else in medieval Europe. The culture that emerged from this unique combination of circumstances was extraordinary. The courts of Toulouse, Foix, and Carcassonne became centers of learning that attracted scholars from across Europe. The poetry of the troubadours, with its celebration of courtly love and refined emotion, influenced literature from England to Sicily. The legal traditions of Roman law provided protections for individual rights unknown in the feudal north. But perhaps most remarkable was the spirit of convivencio coexistence that characterized Occitan society. Jews served as advisors to Christian nobles. Muslim scholars taught in Christian schools. Catholic and Cathar nobles intermarried freely. It was a medieval experiment in religious pluralism that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. This was the world that Count Raymond VI of Toulouse inherited in 1194. Cultured, pragmatic, and politically astute, Raymond embodied both the strengths and contradictions of Occitan civilization. He was nominally Catholic, attending Mass and supporting Catholic institutions, but his sister Esclarmonde was a prominent Cathar perfect, and many of his most trusted advisors were credences. Chapter 2. The Summer of Blood, the response to Innocent's call exceeded even the Pope's expectations. Throughout the spring of 1209, knights from northern France, the Low Countries, and the German borderlands flocked to the papal banners. Unlike the distant and dangerous journey to the Holy Land, this crusade promised quick profits close to home. The heretical south was rich, divided, and seemingly defenseless. What could go wrong? Leading this unprecedented holy war was Arnold Amalric, abbot of Quito and the most powerful Cistercian in Europe. A man of rigid orthodoxy and fierce ambition, Amalric combined genuine religious zeal with a politician's instinct for power. He had served as Innocent III's troubleshooter throughout Europe, crushing dissent and enforcing papal authority wherever resistance emerged. Cistercian historian Brother Augustine Arnold Amalric was the perfect instrument for Innocent's purposes. He possessed absolute faith in the righteousness of his cause and absolute ruthlessness in pursuing it. He saw the world in stark terms: light and darkness, salvation and damnation, with no middle ground. Amalric's army was unlike any that had previously invaded the Languedoc. At its core were several hundred knights from the great noble families of northern France, led by figures like Eudes, 3 of Burgundy, and 4 of Nevers. These were professional warriors, veterans of tournaments and border wars, equipped with the finest armor and weapons that medieval technology could provide. Supporting the knights were several thousand sergeants, professional soldiers of lesser birth but considerable skill. Many were veterans of the northern French campaigns against England and the Holy Roman Empire. They brought with them the military innovations that had made the Capetian monarchy the dominant power in Western Europe: sophisticated siege engines, disciplined infantry formations, and coordinated cavalry tactics. But perhaps the most numerous and certainly the most unpredictable element of the crusading army were the Ribauds mercenaries, camp followers, and adventurers drawn by the promise of plunder. These men had no noble pretensions and little religious motivation. They were there for profit, and they would prove willing to commit atrocities that even hardened knights found shocking. The army that gathered at Lyon in late June 1209 numbered perhaps 20,000 men, the largest military force assembled in France since Charlemagne. Its very existence sent shockwaves throughout the Languedoc. Count Raymond VI, desperate to avoid the fate that awaited him, made a desperate gamble for survival. On June 18, 1209, at the Church of St. Giles, Raymond VI underwent one of the most humiliating spectacles in medieval history. Stripped to the waist before a crowd of nobles and commoners, he was publicly flogged by papal legates while swearing to fight the heretics in his own lands. Contemporary chroniclers describe nobles weeping at the sight of their lord's degradation, while others turned away in shame. Chronicler William of Tudela: "Never was there seen such shame, such grief, and such great sorrow as when they scourged the count at St. Giles. For he was the greatest baron in the world, and the most honored." The humiliation served its immediate purpose. Raymond's excommunication was lifted, and he was allowed to join the crusading army as it marched south. But the deeper damage was irreversible. The Count of Toulouse had been publicly marked as unreliable, a grudging convert whose loyalty would be forever suspect. Meanwhile, the citizens have watched the approaching Crusader army with growing terror. The city's position was impossible. As vassals of the Viscount of Carcassonne, they could not surrender without his permission, but their population included both Catholics and Cathars. And the Crusaders had made clear they would accept nothing less than the surrender of all heretics within the walls. The people have made a final, desperate attempt at negotiation. On July 21, 1209, as the Crusader army deployed outside their walls, they sent a delegation offering to surrender the heretics listed by name in the papal registers. It was a reasonable offer that might have saved the city, but Arnold Amalric rejected it contemptuously. Arnold Amalric's letter to Pope Innocent III: "The citizens of were given the opportunity to separate themselves from the heretics in their midst, but they chose instead to share in their damnation." What followed was the judgment of Almighty God. What followed, in fact, was one of the most shocking massacres in medieval history. On the morning of July 22, 1209, Arnold Amalric ordered a general assault on the city. The attack was intended as a demonstration, show of force that would convince other cities to surrender rather than face similar devastation. But the assault spiraled out of control almost immediately. The rebauds, eager for plunder and unconstrained by chivalric codes, rushed the walls without waiting for orders. To everyone's surprise, they quickly overwhelmed the defenses. What had been planned as a measured siege became a chaotic sack. Chronicler Peter of Les Vaux discern: "Our men rushed into the city. Neither age nor sex was spared. Nearly 20,000 human beings perished at the edge of the sword." After this great slaughter, the whole city was despoiled and burnt. The numbers are certainly exaggerated, probably had a population of 10,000 to 15,000. But the scale of the killing was unprecedented. Unlike the usual medieval practice of holding wealthy citizens for ransom and enslaving the poor, the Crusaders made no distinctions. Nobles and peasants, clergy and laypeople, adults and children were cut down indiscriminately. It was in this context that Arnold Amalric allegedly spoke the words that would echo through history. When the crusading knights asked how they could distinguish Catholic from Cathar in the confusion of the sack, the papal legate reportedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Historian Dr. Mark Gregory, PEGG. Did Amalric actually say those words? The evidence suggests not they first appear in a text written 30 years later by someone who was unthere. But they perfectly capture the spirit of what happened, at systematic, indiscriminate slaughter justified by religious fanaticism. Whether the words were spoken or not, their sentiment was certainly enacted. The massacre established the pattern that would characterize the entire crusade: extreme violence rationalized by extreme piety. The Crusaders saw themselves as instruments of divine judgment, purifying the land through fire and sword. The psychological impact of destruction reverberated throughout the Languedoc. City after city surrendered without resistance, their populations fleeing before the advancing Crusaders. The Viscount of Carcassonne Raymond Drager, Trencavel, found himself isolated and outnumbered as his vassals abandoned him to save themselves. Young, brave, and tragically naive, Raymond Drager Trencavel embodied the best qualities of Occitan nobility. Though personally orthodox in his Catholic beliefs, he refused to abandon the Cathars among his subjects. Unlike Raymond VI of Toulouse, he would not purchase survival with his honor. Historian Dr. Claire Taylor Trencavel was everything a medieval knight was supposed to be: loyal to his vassals, protective of his subjects, courageous in the face of overwhelming odds. In any other age, he would have been celebrated as a hero. In 1209, those very qualities condemned him to destruction. On August 1, 1209, the Crusader army arrived before the walls of Carcassonne. The city was strong, well supplied, and defended by experienced warriors. Under normal circumstances, it might have held out for months or even years. But these were not normal circumstances. The siege of Carcassonne revealed the crushing disparity between the resources of the Crusaders and the defenders. The Northerners brought with them the most sophisticated siege technology of the age: massive trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds, mangonels that could maintain a constant barrage of smaller projectiles, and mobile siege towers that allowed attackers to assault the walls directly. More devastating than the physical siege engines was the psychological warfare employed by the Crusaders. The fate of had preceded them, and the defenders knew exactly what awaited them if the walls were breached. Every day brought new refugees with stories of atrocities committed elsewhere. Morale cracked under the constant pressure. Chronicler William of Tudela: the siege engines battered the walls day and night, and the people within grew weak with fear and thirst. They saw that they could not long endure and began to despair of salvation. Perhaps most damaging of all was the cutting of the city's water supply. Medieval Carcassonne depended on springs and wells that lay outside the walls. The Crusaders quickly seized these sources, forcing the defenders to rely on stored rainwater that grew more precious with each passing day. After just 2 weeks of siege, Raymond Drager Trencavel requested a parley. It was a trap. When the young Viscount emerged from the city under a flag of truce, the Crusaders seized him and threw him into his own dungeon. Leaderless and demoralized, Carcassonne surrendered within hours. The fate of the Trencavel family illustrated the transformation of the Crusade from a religious war into a campaign of conquest. Raymond Drager died in captivity within 3 months officially of dysentery, though poison was widely suspected. His infant son was disinherited, his lands confiscated, and his noble line extinguished. From among the crusading leaders, Arnold Amalric selected Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, to receive the confiscated Trencavel domains. It was a choice that would shape the next decade of the Crusade and cement de Montfort's place as one of the most controversial figures in medieval history. Historian Dr. Malcolm Barber: Simon de Montfort was the perfect fusion of medieval piety and medieval ruthlessness. He genuinely believed that God had called him to purify the South through fire and sword, and he pursued that mission with a determination that bordered on fanaticism. Born around 1165 into one of the great Anglo-Norman noble families, Simon de Montfort had spent his early career as a classic knight errant. He had participated in the Fourth Crusade, but left in disgust when the Crusaders attacked the Christian city of Zara instead of marching to the Holy Land. That experience had convinced him that God demanded absolute obedience to the Church's commands, regardless of political complications. De Montfort's acceptance of the Trencavel inheritance marked the beginning of a new phase in the Albigensian Crusade. What had begun as a papal initiative to suppress heresy became a systematic campaign of territorial conquest. The religious war had become a colonial war, with northern French nobles seizing the lands and wealth of the South under the cover of fighting heresy. The transformation was symbolized by the mass departure of Crusaders following the fall of Carcassonne. Having fulfilled their 40-day obligation and earned their spiritual rewards, most of the knights returned to their northern homes laden with plunder. Arnold Amalric departed to claim his reward as Archbishop of Narbonne. The great crusading army dissolved, leaving de Montfort with perhaps 500 knights to hold and expand his new domains. But those 500 knights were enough. They were professionals, experienced in the brutal warfare of the northern frontiers. And they were commanded by a leader of exceptional military ability. More importantly, they were motivated not just by religious zeal, but by the prospect of permanent settlement in some of the richest lands in Europe. What followed was a methodical campaign of conquest and terror that would make de Montfort's name synonymous with religious persecution. His strategy was brutally simple. Make the cost of protecting heretics so high that even sympathetic nobles would abandon them. Every castle that resisted was razed. Every garrison that fought was slaughtered. Every perfect who refused to recant was burned alive. The massacre at Minerve in July 1210 established the pattern. When the fortress finally surrendered after a grinding siege, de Montfort offered the Cathar perfects within the choice of conversion or death. Not one of the 140 perfects chose apostasy. They were burned en masse in a pyre that contemporary chroniclers described as visible for miles across the countryside. Peter of Lesvaux discerned a fire was lit and they were all cast into it. And I believe that about 140 heretics were burned there. Our men did not need to cast them in, for they were rendered so obstinate by the devil that they cast themselves in. The chronicler's language reveals the psychological framework that justified such atrocities. The perfects were not martyrs dying for their faith, but devils choosing their own damnation. Their courage in facing death was not admirable, but demonic. Their refusal to recant proved not the sincerity of their beliefs, but their corruption by Satan. This dehumanization of the enemy was essential to the Crusaders' self-image. They could not see themselves as persecutors killing fellow Christians. They had to be warriors of Christ, destroying the enemies of God. The more courageously the Cathars faced death, the more convinced the Crusaders became that they were dealing with superhuman evil. The campaign continued through 1210 and 1211 with mechanical efficiency. Chateau after chateau fell to de Montfort's siege engines. Town after town opened its gates rather than face destruction. The Cathar Church, which had seemed so vibrant and confident just 3 years earlier, found itself without protectors and defenseless against systematic persecution. At Lavore, in May 1211, the pattern of conquest and massacre reached new heights of brutality. The castle was defended by Imry of and his sister Giraud, both prominent Cathar nobles. When the fortress finally fell after a 2-month siege, de Montfort's revenge was comprehensive and theatrical. Imry of was hanged, then his body was burned. His sister Giraud was thrown into a well and stoned to death. Fate that chroniclers described as fitting for a woman who had perverted the natural order by preaching and leading men. Over 400 Cathar perfects were burned in the largest pyre yet seen in the crusade. William of Tudela, they kindled such a fire that the smoke and the flame rose up to the clouds. Never was such a holocaust made since the time of the Saracens. The language is significant. Medieval chroniclers typically reserve the term Holocaust, literally burnt offering, for the ritual sacrifices of the Old Testament. By applying it to the burning of heretics, they transformed mass murder into sacred ritual, making de Montfort's atrocities not just acceptable, but holy. By the end of 1211, de Montfort controlled most of the territories that had once belonged to the Trencavel family. His success attracted new recruits from northern France, younger sons and landless knights who saw opportunity in the conquered south. A colonial administration began to emerge, with northern French nobles replacing the old Occitan aristocracy and northern French law replacing the Roman legal traditions of the region. But the greatest prize remained tantalizingly out of reach. Raymond VI of Toulouse. Despite his public humiliation and grudging participation in the early phases of the crusade, had managed to preserve most of his domains. His capital city remained unconquered, his treasury intact, his military potential unbroken. The conflict between de Montfort and Raymond VI was inevitable. Both men claimed to represent legitimate authority in the Languedoc de Montfort as the Pope's champion and defender of orthodoxy. Raymond as the hereditary count whose family had ruled Toulouse for centuries. Their struggle would determine whether the Albigensian Crusade succeeded in permanently transforming the South, or whether the old order would survive to fight another day. Historian Dr. Joseph Strayer, the confrontation between de Montfort and Raymond VI was more than a personal rivalry. It was a clash between two visions of medieval society: the papal monarchy's dream of unified Christendom versus the older tradition of regional autonomy and religious diversity. Raymond's position was precarious, but not hopeless. He retained the loyalty of most of his subjects, who saw him as a protector against northern aggression, rather than a defender of heresy. His treasury, swollen by the commercial prosperity of Toulouse, could finance military resistance for years. Most importantly, he had potential allies beyond the borders of France who might intervene if the crusade threatened their own interests. Chief among these potential allies was Peter II of Aragon, whose territories extended well into the Languedoc, and whose vassals included many of the nobles being dispossessed by de Montfort. Peter II was no heretic indeed. He was one of the great heroes of the Reconquista, having played a crucial role in the Christian victory over the Almohads at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. But he was also a pragmatic politician who understood that the French conquest of the Languedoc would eliminate Aragonese influence north of the Pyrenees. The stage was set for the most decisive confrontation of the entire crusade, the Battle of Muret, which would determine whether the Albigensian Crusade would succeed or fail, whether the Languedoc would become French or remain independent, whether Catharism would be extinguished or survive to challenge Catholic orthodoxy for generations to come. Chapter 3. The perfect crusader Simon de Montfort stood at the pinnacle of medieval knighthood, embodying both its highest ideals and its darkest contradictions. Born into the Anglo-Norman nobility around 1165, he inherited not just lands and titles, but a warrior culture that had dominated Europe for 2 centuries. Yet in the sun-baked lands of the Languedoc, this paragon of chivalry would become the architect of systematic religious persecution. The de Montfort family exemplified the international character of medieval nobility. Simon's grandfather had been a companion of William the Conqueror at Hastings. His father had fought in the Holy Land during the Second Crusade. Simon himself held lands in both England and France, spoke multiple languages, and moved easily between the courts of different kingdoms. Historian Dr. John Gillingham, Simon de Montfort was the product of a military aristocracy that had spent 2 centuries conquering and colonizing. For such men, warfare was not just a profession, but a sacred calling. They saw themselves as God's warriors, bringing order to chaos and light to darkness. De Montfort's early career followed the predictable pattern of a younger son seeking to make his fortune through military service. He participated in tournaments, served various lords as a household knight, and dreamed of winning land and glory in foreign wars. The Fourth Crusade, called by Pope Innocent III in 1202, seemed to offer the perfect opportunity. But the Fourth Crusade became a disaster that profoundly shaped de Montfort's worldview. Instead of marching to the Holy Land to fight Muslims, the crusading army was diverted to attack Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast. When the Crusaders then turned their weapons against Constantinople itself, the capital of Orthodox Christianity, de Montfort was among the minority who refused to participate. Chronicler Geoffrey de Villers-Douin, the Earl of Leicester, and many other good men departed from the host because they could not agree to the assault upon Christians, and went to Syria by other ways. De Montfort's disgust with the Fourth Crusade's perversion revealed both his rigid piety and his inflexible character. While other knights rationalized their participation with arguments about political necessity or divine providence, de Montfort saw only betrayal of sacred vows. This experience convinced him that God demanded absolute obedience to church authority. Regardless of political complexities or personal cost, Returning to France in 1204, de Montfort found himself a man without a clear purpose. His English estates provided modest income, but his ambitions demanded more. He was approaching 40, an advanced age for a medieval knight still seeking to establish his fortune. The call to crusade against the Cathars in 1209 offered him a second chance at the glory and salvation that had eluded him in the East. Historian Dr. Claire Taylor for de Montfort. The Albigensian Crusade represented the perfect fusion of personal ambition and religious duty. Here was a holy war that wouldn't be perverted by political compromise. A chance to serve God while building a dynasty in some of the richest lands in Europe. De Montfort's acceptance of the Trencavel inheritance in August 1209 marked the beginning of his transformation from knight-errant to territorial lord. But the lands he inherited were not empty domains waiting to be settled. They were populated by communities with their own traditions, laws, and loyalties, many of which were fundamentally incompatible with his vision of orthodox Christian society. The challenge facing de Montfort was unprecedented in medieval warfare. Previous conquests had typically involved replacing one ruling elite with another while leaving the basic structure of society intact. But the Albigensian Crusade demanded something far more radical: the complete transformation of a civilization's religious and cultural identity. De Montfort's solution was systematic and methodical. He would make the protection of heretics so costly that even sympathetic nobles would abandon them. He would make the practice of Catharism so dangerous that even committed believers would recant. He would break the spirit of Occitan resistance through calculated displays of overwhelming force. The Siege of Minerve in the summer of 1210 provided de Montfort with his first opportunity to implement this strategy on a large scale. The fortress, perched on a rocky promontory above the river Cesse, was considered impregnable by conventional assault. Its lord, William of Minerve, was a prominent supporter of the Cathars, who had offered refuge to numerous perfects fleeing from other conquered territories. De Montfort's siege of Minerve demonstrated the technological superiority that gave the Crusaders their decisive advantage. His engineers constructed massive stone-throwing engines that could hurl projectiles weighing several hundred pounds. These mangonels and trebuchets operated continuously, day and night, gradually reducing the fortress walls to rubble. Peter of Les Vaux discerned, the Count had a mangonel made which the soldiers called Bad Neighbor because it damaged so many places in the castle. Day and night it cast stones so large and so frequently that those within could find no safe place. But de Montfort's most devastating weapon was his ability to cut off the fortress's water supply. Medieval castles depended on wells or springs that were vulnerable to siege tactics. At Minerve, de Montfort's engineers managed to block the underground channels that fed the fortress's cisterns, forcing the defenders to rely on rapidly dwindling reserves. After 7 weeks of siege, William of Minerve negotiated surrender terms that seemed reasonable by medieval standards. The garrison would be allowed to depart with honor, the civilian population would be spared, and only those who persisted in heresy after being given the opportunity to recant would face punishment. But when the fortress gates opened on July 22, 1210, exactly 1 year after the massacre, at de Montfort revealed the true nature of his holy war. 140 Cathar perfects were assembled in the town square and given a final ultimatum: renounce their faith or burn. To the amazement of the Crusaders, not a single perfect chose apostasy. Historian Dr. Malcolm Barber, the mass martyrdom at Minerve, established a pattern that would be repeated throughout the crusade. The Cathars faced death with a courage that their persecutors found both infuriating and terrifying. How could people choose the flames unless they were possessed by demons? The perfect's willingness to die for their beliefs created a profound psychological problem for their Crusader opponents. Medieval Christianity taught that martyrdom was the highest form of witness to truth. If the Cathars died courageously for their convictions, didn't that suggest their convictions might be true? The only way to resolve this cognitive dissonance was to deny that Cathar martyrs were genuine martyrs at all. The solution was theological and linguistic. The perfects weren't dying for truth, but for error. They weren't demonstrating faith, but fanaticism. They weren't choosing martyrdom, but suicide. Their courage wasn't admirable, but demonic. By redefining Cathar resistance in these terms, the Crusaders could maintain their self-image as God's warriors, while systematically destroying communities of extraordinary piety. The burning of the Minerve Perfect sent shockwaves throughout the surviving Cathar communities. The message was clear. De Montfort would show no mercy to heretics, regardless of their personal sanctity or the admiration they inspired among their followers. The choice was stark conversion or annihilation. Yet the policy of systematic terror produced unexpected results. Rather than breaking Cathar resistance, it seemed to strengthen it. Communities that might have gradually drifted away from heretical beliefs under gentle pressure became more committed when faced with violent persecution. The Perfects' heroic deaths became rallying points for continued resistance rather than warnings to submit. Historian Dr. Bernard Hamilton, persecution created martyrs, and martyrs created legends. Every Perfect who died in the flames became a saint in popular memory. De Montfort was winning military victories while losing the battle for hearts and minds. The fortress of Lavore, which fell to de Montfort in May 1211, provided an even more dramatic example of this dynamic. The castle was defended by Aymery, of one of the most prominent Cathar nobles in the Languedoc, and his sister Giraud, who served as a Perfect and preached to mixed congregations of men and women. The siege of Lavore lasted 2 months and demonstrated both de Montfort's military expertise and his growing ruthlessness. His siege engine systematically reduced the fortress walls, while his engineers undermined the foundations of key towers. When hunger and thirst had weakened the defenders, he launched coordinated assaults that overwhelmed the remaining resistance. But it was de Montfort's treatment of the defeated garrison that revealed how far the crusade had moved from conventional medieval warfare. Aymeric was hanged as a traitor to the faith. Then his body was burned to deny him even the dignity of proper burial. His sister Giraud met an even more horrific fate. She was thrown into a well and stoned to death by crusading soldiers who shouted that this was fitting punishment for a woman who had dared to preach. William of Tudela, never was there seen such cruelty as was done at Lavore. The Lady Giraud they cast into a pit and covered her with stones, because she had preached and taught and had corrupted many people. The language reveals the intersection of religious and gender prejudices that shaped Crusader behavior. Giraud's crime was not simply heresy, but the violation of prescribed gender roles. By preaching to men and assuming religious authority, she had challenged the fundamental order of Christian society. Her destruction was necessary not just to eliminate heresy, but to restore proper hierarchy. The massacre at Lavore climaxed with the burning of over 400 Cathar Perfects, the largest mass execution yet seen in the Crusade. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find adequate words for the scale of the slaughter. Some compared it to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Others invoked the sacrificial rituals of the Old Testament. All agreed that it represented divine judgment on a scale not seen since biblical times. Yet even as de Montfort achieved these military victories, his political position remained precarious. His original crusading army had largely disbanded, leaving him with a small core of permanent supporters supplemented by seasonal recruits, who served their 40-day obligations and returned home. His treasury was constantly strained by the cost of maintaining siege engines, paying mercenaries, and garrisoning conquered territories. Most critically, de Montfort's harsh methods were generating opposition even among Catholics who had initially supported the crusade. The old Occitan nobility, regardless of their personal religious beliefs, began to see him as a foreign conqueror threatening their traditional freedoms. The commercial classes of the great cities worried that his religious purges would disrupt the trade networks that sustained their prosperity. Historian Dr. Joseph Strayer de Montfort's early successes contained the seeds of his eventual downfall. The more territory he conquered, the more enemies he made. The more Cathars he burned, the more Catholics began to question whether the cure was worse than the disease. The growing opposition to de Montfort's rule crystallized around the figure of Raymond VI of Toulouse. Despite his public humiliation at St. Gilles and his formal participation in the early stages of the Crusade, Raymond had managed to preserve most of his territories and much of his authority. His subjects, both Catholic and Cathar, increasingly saw him as their defender against northern aggression. The inevitable confrontation between de Montfort and Raymond VI came in 1211, when the papal legates declared the Count of Toulouse to be in breach of his crusading vows. The specific accusations were technical. He had failed to dismiss certain advisors, had not confiscated enough heretical property, had shown insufficient zeal in hunting down fugitive perfects. But the real issue was political. Raymond's continued independence represented an obstacle to the complete French conquest of the Languedoc. Raymond's response was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than submit to demands that would have reduced him to a puppet ruler, he chose open resistance. In late 1211, he fled to England to seek support from King John, his brother-in-law. From there, he traveled to Rome to present his case directly to Pope Innocent III. His message was simple. The crusade had exceeded its original purpose and become a war of conquest that threatened the stability of all Europe. Raymond V's petition to Pope Innocent III: Holy Father, I have lost everything, my lands, my castles, my people, not for any heresy of my own, but because I would not make war upon my own subjects without cause. If this be the will of God, then God's will is hard indeed. Pope Innocent III found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The Albigensian Crusade was achieving its religious objectives. Catharism was being systematically eliminated from territories under Crusader control. But it was also creating political complications that threatened to involve the entire European state system. The King of Aragon was mobilizing to protect his vassals. The Holy Roman Emperor was expressing concern about French expansion. Even the King of England was considering intervention. While Raymond VI argued his case in the papal court, events in the Languedoc were moving toward a climax. De Montfort, emboldened by his military successes and convinced of divine support, decided to force a final confrontation by laying siege to Toulouse itself. If he could capture the greatest city in the south, the crusade would be effectively over. The siege of Toulouse began in June 1212 and immediately revealed the limitations of de Montfort's position. Unlike the isolated fortresses he had previously conquered, Toulouse was a major commercial center with extensive resources and a population fiercely loyal to their traditional rulers. The city's walls were strong, its defenses well organized, and its morale unbroken. More significantly, de Montfort found himself facing not just the garrison of Toulouse, but a coalition of southern nobles who had decided that their own survival depended on stopping his advance. For the first time since the crusade began, he was outnumbered and fighting on enemy ground against opponents who matched his tactical skill. Peter of Lesvaux-Discern. The siege of Toulouse proved longer and more difficult than any that the Count had undertaken. The citizens fought with desperate courage, knowing that surrender meant not just defeat, but the destruction of their way of life. The siege dragged on through the summer and into the autumn of 1212. With neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. De Montfort's siege engines battered the city walls, but the defenders repaired the damage as quickly as it was inflicted. Assault after assault was repulsed with heavy casualties. For the first time in his career as a crusader, de Montfort was forced to admit failure and lift the siege. The psychological impact of Toulouse's successful resistance was enormous. De Montfort's aura of invincibility was broken. The southern nobles who had submitted to him out of fear began to reconsider their allegiances. Most dangerously of all, King Peter II of Aragon decided that the time had come for direct intervention to prevent the complete French conquest of his sphere of influence. Peter II of Aragon was one of the most formidable monarchs of his age. He had played a crucial role in the great Christian victory over the Almohads at Las Navas de Tolosa, in 1212, establishing his reputation as a champion of the faith. He was personally orthodox in his religious beliefs and had no sympathy for Cathar theology. But he was also a pragmatic politician who understood that the French conquest of the Languedoc would eliminate Aragonese influence north of the Pyrenees forever. Historian Dr. Thomas Bisson for Peter II, the Albigensian Crusade had become a threat to the entire balance of power in southwestern Europe. If the French succeeded in conquering the Languedoc, Aragon would be reduced to a minor regional power trapped between France and Castile. Peter's decision to intervene was carefully calculated. He could not openly oppose a papal crusade, but he could claim to be protecting his own vassals from unjust persecution. Many of the nobles being dispossessed by de Montfort held lands from the Crown of Aragon as well as from French lords. Peter had both the right and the duty to defend them. In the spring of 1213, Peter II began assembling the largest army ever seen in the medieval Languedoc. His core forces consisted of Aragonese knights experienced in the wars against the Muslims. But he was joined by dispossessed Occitan nobles eager to reclaim their patrimony. The combined army that crossed the Pyrenees numbered perhaps 15,000 men, far larger than any force de Montfort could hope to match. The stage was set for the most decisive battle of the entire Albigensian Crusade. At the small town of Muret, south of Toulouse, the two visions of medieval Europe would clash in mortal combat. On one side stood de Montfort with his 900 crusading knights representing papal authority and religious orthodoxy. On the other stood Peter II with his massive coalition representing regional independence and political pragmatism. The outcome of the Battle of Muret would determine not just the fate of the Languedoc, but the future shape of European civilization. Would the papal monarchy succeed in its dream of unified Christendom under Roman authority? Or would the older tradition of regional diversity and political pluralism survive to challenge centralized power for generations to come? Chapter 4. The King's Gambit, the summer of 1213, brought to the Languedoc an army unlike any the region had ever seen. King Peter II of Aragon, called the Catholic for his role in the great victory over the Almohads at Las Navas de Tolosa, led a coalition that represented the last hope of southern independence. His banners bore not just the arms of Aragon, but those of Toulouse, Foix, Comminges, and a dozen other noble houses that had been dispossessed by Simon de Montfort's relentless advance. Peter II was no ordinary medieval king. At 1309, he stood at the height of his powers, commanding respect throughout Christian Europe as both a successful warrior and a pious ruler. His victory at Las Navas de Tolosa the previous year had broken Muslim power in Iberia and earned him recognition as one of Christendom's greatest champions. Pope Innocent III himself had crowned him in Rome, blessing him as a defender of the faith. Historian Dr. Thomas Bisson. Peter II embodied the complexity of medieval politics. He was simultaneously a papal vassal, a crusading hero, and a pragmatic monarch defending his territorial interests. His intervention in the Languedoc wasn't about supporting heresy, it was about preventing French hegemony in southwestern Europe. The king's decision to intervene had been years in the making. His domains extended well into the Languedoc, where he held direct lordship over territories like Montpellier and suzerainty over numerous vassals who were being systematically dispossessed by the Crusaders. More fundamentally, the French conquest of the south threatened to encircle Aragon with hostile territory and reduce it to a minor regional power. But Peter's intervention required careful diplomatic preparation. He could not be seen as opposing a papal crusade or protecting heretics. Instead, he presented himself as defending his legitimate vassals against unjust persecution and protecting the rights of Orthodox Catholics who happened to live under rulers accused of tolerating heresy. The army that assembled under Peter's banners in the spring of 1213 reflected this complex political reality. At its core were perhaps 1,000 Aragonese knights, veteran warriors hardened by decades of frontier warfare against the Muslims. These men brought with them the tactical innovations developed in the Reconquista: disciplined cavalry charges, coordinated infantry support, and sophisticated siege techniques. Alongside the Aragonese rode the flower of Occitan chivalry. Raymond VI of Toulouse had returned from his diplomatic missions with renewed determination to reclaim his patrimony. His son, the future Raymond VII, brought energy and idealism to complement his father's experience and cunning. The Count of Foix's Raymond Roger contributed not just his own followers, but his intimate knowledge of every castle and mountain pass in the region. Chronicler William of Tudela: never was there seen such a gathering of noble knights and proven warriors. The banners of Aragon and Toulouse flew side by side, and men said that surely God favored so righteous a cause. The coalition's strength lay not just in numbers, but in motivation. Unlike de Montfort's crusaders, who were fighting for abstract religious principles and distant rewards, Peter's army was defending homes, families, and ancestral rights. Every Occitan knight in the ranks had personal reasons to hate the northern invaders who had seized their lands and burned their kinsmen. Yet this strength was also a weakness. The coalition was held together by temporary necessity rather than permanent loyalty. Aragonese and Occitan nobles had different objectives, different fighting styles, and different ideas about acceptable casualties. Peter II was commanding not a unified army, but an alliance of convenience that might dissolve at the first serious setback. De Montfort's position, by contrast, was desperate but unified. His army numbered fewer than 1,000 knights and perhaps 2,000 infantry, less than a tenth of the force arrayed against him. His treasury was nearly empty, his supply lines stretched thin, and his political support eroding as news of Peter's intervention spread throughout Europe. But de Montfort possessed advantages that mere numbers could not measure. His core followers were veterans of dozens of sieges and battles, men who had been fighting together for 4 years and had developed an almost telepathic coordination. They were fighting for survival, which gave them the desperate courage of cornered wolves. Most importantly, they were led by one of the finest tactical commanders of the age. Military historian Sir Charles Omat Simon de Montfort was a general of genius, capable of seeing opportunities that others missed and acting on them with lightning speed. At Muret, he faced odds that would have terrified any reasonable commander. But he possessed the supreme military virtue, the ability to turn desperate necessity into tactical advantage. The confrontation came to a head in September 1213, when Peter's army advanced to besiege the small town of Muret, where de Montfort had established a forward base. The town's position was strategically vital, controlling the approaches to Toulouse and serving as a staging area for Crusader operations. If it fell, de Montfort would be forced to abandon his offensive operations and retreat to his core territories around Carcassonne. Peter's siege of Muret demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of his coalition. The Aragonese siege engines were among the finest in Europe, capable of reducing even strong fortifications to rubble. The combined army was large enough to completely surround the town and cut off all supply routes. The morale of the attackers was high, boosted by confidence in their numerical superiority and their king's reputation for military genius. But the siege also revealed the coordination problems that plagued the coalition. Different contingents used different languages, different signals, and different tactical doctrines. The Aragonese wanted to conduct a methodical siege, systematically reducing the defenses before attempting an assault. The Occitan nobles, eager to reclaim their lands, pressed for immediate attacks regardless of casualties. Peter of Lesvaux-Discerne, the King of Aragon, commanded a multitude, but it was a multitude without unity. Each lord fought for his own glory rather than the common cause, and their discord was the seed of their destruction. De Montfort, trapped within Muret's walls, faced an impossible situation by conventional military logic. His enemies outnumbered him by at least 10-1. His defenses, while strong, could not indefinitely withstand the pounding of Peter's siege engines. His supplies were limited, and there was no prospect of relief from external forces. But de Montfort was not a conventional commander, and he had no intention of conducting a conventional defense. Instead, he began planning one of the most audacious attacks in medieval military history, a sortie designed not merely to harass the besiegers, but to destroy them entirely. The plan de Montfort conceived was breathtakingly simple and suicidally dangerous. Rather than waiting for the siege to grind him down, he would burst out of Muret with his entire force and attack the enemy camp directly. The assault would depend on surprise, speed, and the shock value of disciplined, heavy cavalry striking unprepared opponents. Every aspect of the plan defied military common sense. Cavalry charges were most effective on open ground, but de Montfort would be attacking from a confined space with limited room for maneuver. Medieval armies were most vulnerable when dispersed in camp, but Peter's forces were actively besieging a fortress and should have been alert to the possibility of sortie. Most critically, the attackers would have no line of retreat if the assault failed. The entire crusading army would be annihilated. Historian Dr. Jean-Francois de Montfort's plan for Muret violated every principle of medieval military wisdom. But it also possessed the supreme virtue of being completely unexpected. Peter's army was prepared for everything except a direct frontal assault by the entire garrison. On the morning of September 12, 1213, de Montfort revealed his plan to his assembled knights. Contemporary chroniclers record that many were initially appalled by its apparent suicidal nature. But de Montfort's personal magnetism and absolute confidence gradually won them over. If their leader was willing to stake everything on a single desperate gamble, they would follow him into hell itself. The psychological preparation for the attack was as important as the tactical planning. De Montfort and his followers spent the hours before dawn in prayer, receiving communion and making their final confessions. They were not just preparing for battle, but for martyrdom, a holy death in defense of the faith. That would guarantee their soul's salvation regardless of the earthly outcome. As the sun rose over Muret, de Montfort organized his forces into 3 divisions, each with a specific tactical role. The first squadron, led by experienced veterans like Alling of Russie, would punch through the enemy's forward positions and create a breach for the following units. The second squadron would exploit that breach, driving deep into the enemy camp to spread confusion and panic. De Montfort himself would lead the third and most crucial squadron in a flanking maneuver designed to strike directly at King Peter II and his bodyguard. Medieval armies depended on the personal leadership of their commanders. If Peter could be killed or captured, his entire coalition would likely collapse regardless of its numerical superiority. William of Tudela, Count Simon, armed himself like a knight of the Round Table, placing his trust not in numbers, but in God and his own right arm. His face shone with holy purpose, and all who saw him knew that this day would decide the fate of nations. At approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, the gates of Muret swung open and de Montfort's cavalry thundered out. The psychological impact of their appearance was enormous. The besiegers had grown accustomed to the routine of siege warfare, the methodical bombardment of walls, the slow construction of approach trenches, the gradual tightening of the blockade. The sudden eruption of the entire enemy garrison in full battle array caught them completely off guard. The first squadron, led by Alling of Russie, struck the Occitan militia with devastating effect. These troops, while numerous and enthusiastic, lacked the armor and training of professional warriors. When several hundred fully armored knights struck their line at full gallop, the militia disintegrated almost instantly. Peasants and townsmen who had joined the army more from local loyalty than military experience fled in panic, abandoning their weapons and equipment. The collapse of the militia exposed the more serious weakness in Peter's battle array. Instead of concentrating his forces for maximum impact, he had spread them across a wide area to maintain the siege lines. when de Montfort's second squadron exploited the breach created by the first attack. They found themselves attacking isolated contingents that could not support each other effectively. But the decisive moment came when de Montfort himself led his third squadron in a sweeping flanking maneuver that brought him face to face with King Peter II and the flower of Aragonese chivalry. This was the encounter that would determine the battle's outcome. Experienced professionals fighting for their lives against equally experienced professionals fighting for glory and political advantage. Peter of Les Fox Discern, the Count Simon, charged like a lion among sheep, his sword dealing death at every stroke. But the King of Aragon was no coward, and around him gathered the bravest knights of Spain. Determined to sell their lives dearly, the melee that followed was brief but incredibly violent. Medieval cavalry combat was typically decided within minutes. Either the charge succeeded in breaking enemy morale, or it bogged down in a grinding battle of attrition that favored the side with greater numbers. De Montfort's success depended on achieving maximum shock effect before Peter's numerical superiority could assert itself. The crucial factor proved to be a tactical error by King Peter II that violated the most basic principles of medieval command. Seeking to inspire his troops by personal example, the king had exchanged armor with one of his knights, adopting the common medieval practice of disguising royal identity to prevent targeted attacks. But in the confusion of the melee, this precaution backfired catastrophically. When de Montfort's squadron struck the Aragonese line, they had no way of distinguishing the disguised king from his companions. In the swirling chaos of combat, with visibility limited by helmet visors and clouds of dust, Peter II was struck down and killed by an unknown hand. His death was not initially recognized by either side, just another casualty in a battle that was producing hundreds of them. Historian Dr. Luis Garcia de Valdevella knows Peter II's death at Muret was one of those random events that changed the course of history. If he had maintained his royal insignia, de Montfort's knights would probably have tried to capture rather than kill him. A living king could be ransomed. A dead king was merely a disaster. The discovery of Peter's body triggered the immediate collapse of the entire coalition. Medieval armies were held together by personal bonds of loyalty to their commanders. When those commanders fell, their followers typically considered their obligations discharged and sought to save themselves rather than continue a now hopeless fight. The psychological shock was compounded by the practical problems of command succession. Peter II had been the only figure with sufficient prestige to hold the coalition together. With his death, the various contingents began looking to their own interests rather than the common cause. The Aragonese, leaderless and far from home, began an immediate retreat toward the Pyrenees. The Occitan nobles, seeing their main ally eliminated, scattered to their individual strongholds. Within hours, an army of 15,000 men had simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. De Montfort's 900 knights found themselves masters of the field, surrounded by the abandoned equipment and supplies of an enemy that had outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. It was one of the most complete victories in medieval military history. Chronicler William of Tudela, "Never was there such a rout since the world began. An army that seemed invincible in the morning was scattered to the winds before evening, and the flower of Occitan chivalry lay dead upon the field." The strategic consequences of Muret were immediate and decisive. Raymond, the Sixth of Toulouse, his hopes of military restoration shattered, fled into exile once again. His son Raymond, the Seventh, managed to escape the battlefield, but found himself a fugitive in his own lands. The Count of Foix retreated to his mountain strongholds, but his offensive capability was broken. Most significantly, the Crown of Aragon's influence in the Languedoc was permanently eliminated. Peter II's heir, the future James I, was only 5 years old, and would spend his minority under the tutelage of Simon de Montfort, himself a hostage to ensure Aragonese non-interference in southern French affairs. The dream of an independent Occitania died with Peter II at Muret. For de Montfort, victory brought both triumph and burden. He was now the undisputed master of the Languedoc. recognized by Pope and King as the legitimate ruler of territories stretching from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. But he was also responsible for governing a hostile population that saw him as a foreign conqueror, rather than a liberating crusader. Historian Dr. Joseph Strayer. Muret was de Montfort's greatest victory and the beginning of his ultimate downfall. Military conquest was one thing. Permanent pacification of a resentful population was quite another. The very completeness of his triumph ensured that resistance would continue underground until the moment was ripe for rebellion. The Battle of Muret marked the end of the Albigensian Crusade's first phase. What had begun as a religious war to suppress heresy had become a successful campaign of territorial conquest. The Cathar Church was broken, its protectors eliminated, its institutional structure destroyed. But the cultural and political identity of the Languedoc, while battered, was not extinguished. It would survive in the shadows, waiting for opportunity to reassert itself against northern domination. The stage was now set for the Crusade's second phase, not a war of conquest, but a struggle for legitimacy. Not a battle between armies, but a contest for the hearts and minds of a conquered population. Simon de Montfort had won the war, but he had yet to win the peace. That would prove a far more difficult and ultimately impossible task. Chapter 5. The Death of a Champion. The years following Muret should have been the golden age of Simon de Montfort's dominion. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the most important ecclesiastical gathering of the High Middle Ages, formally awarded him the county of Toulouse and confirmed his possession of all conquered territories. Pope Innocent III hailed him as a new Judas Maccabeus, a champion of the faith who had purified the Church through holy war. Yet even at the moment of his greatest triumph, the seeds of de Montfort's destruction were already taking root. The very completeness of his military victory had eliminated the external enemies who had previously united his followers in common cause. Now, instead of fighting foreign invaders, he faced the far more difficult task of governing a hostile population that regarded him as an occupying tyrant. Historian Dr. Malcolm Barber. De Montfort's situation after 1215 resembled that of a colonial administrator more than a medieval lord. He ruled through force and fear rather than consent and custom. Such regimes can survive temporarily, but they inevitably generate the resistance that destroys them. The administrative challenge facing de Montfort was unprecedented in medieval European experience. Previous conquests had typically involved replacing one ruling elite with another while leaving the basic social structure intact. But the Albigensian Crusade had demanded something far more radical: the complete transformation of a civilization's religious, cultural, and legal identity. De Montfort's solution was systematic cultural imperialism. He replaced Occitan nobles with northern French administrators, substituted customary law with royal ordinances, and imposed northern French linguistic and cultural norms on institutions throughout his domains. Churches were purged of clergy suspected of heretical sympathies and restaffed with northern French priests. Schools were placed under the supervision of Dominican inquisitors. Even commercial practices were modified to conform to northern European models. The results were predictably disastrous for social cohesion. The new administrators, unfamiliar with local customs and contemptuous of regional traditions, made decisions that outraged their subjects. The replacement clergy, unable to speak the local language and ignorant of community dynamics, found themselves preaching to empty churches. The inquisitors, armed with sweeping powers to investigate heretical beliefs, created an atmosphere of suspicion and terror that poisoned daily life. William of Tudela. The land groaned under foreign rule. Where once there had been joy and music, now there was only fear and silence. The troubadours no longer sang, for who would dare express the heart's true feelings when every word might be reported to the inquisitors? Perhaps most damaging to de Montfort's long-term position was his systematic destruction of the Languedoc's commercial prosperity. The region's wealth had been built on trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world with northern Europe. Jewish merchants, Muslim scholars, and Orthodox Christian traders had all played crucial roles in this economic ecosystem. But de Montfort's religious purification campaign made no distinction between heretical, Christians, and non-Christian minorities. Jewish communities were expelled or forced into ghettos. Muslim scholars fled to Spain or North Africa. Orthodox Christian merchants found their activities restricted by suspicion of doctrinal deviation. The cosmopolitan commercial culture that had made the Languedoc prosperous was systematically dismantled in the name of religious orthodoxy. The economic consequences were severe and immediate. Trade routes that had operate. The economic consequences were severe and immediate. Trade routes that had operated for centuries were disrupted. Banking networks collapsed when their key participants were eliminated. Craft guilds that had depended on diverse religious communities found themselves unable to maintain their traditional skills and practices. Economic historian Dr. Robert Lopez. The Albigensian Crusade destroyed one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated economic systems. The Languedoc had been a bridge between the Islamic world and Christian Europe, facilitating exchanges of not just goods but knowledge, techniques, and cultural innovations. De Montfort's religious purification severed those connections permanently. The decline in prosperity had immediate political consequences. The urban middle classes, who had initially been neutral or even supportive of the Crusade's religious objectives, began to turn against de Montfort's administration. Merchants watched their businesses collapse. Artisans saw their livelihoods disappear. And professionals found their services no longer in demand. Even more dangerous was the alienation of the rural nobility. De Montfort had been forced to reward his northern French followers with lands confiscated from suspected heretics. But medieval society depended on complex networks of personal relationships, family alliances, and customary obligations that could not simply be transferred from one group to another. A northern French knight might receive the legal title to an Occitan castle, but he would lack the intimate knowledge of local conditions, family relationships, and traditional practices that made effective lordship possible. His subjects would obey from fear rather than loyalty, serve from compulsion rather than duty, and constantly seek opportunities to overthrow an authority they regarded as illegitimate. Historian Dr. Claire Taylor. Medieval feudalism wasn't just about land tenure, was about personal relationships built up over generations. De Montfort could redistribute property, but he couldn't transfer the bonds of loyalty and custom that made the system work. His new order was legally valid, but sociologically hollow. By 1216, signs of growing resistance were apparent throughout de Montfort's domains. Tax collection became increasingly difficult as communities claimed poverty or found excuses to delay payment. Recruitment for military service met with evasion and passive resistance. Reports reached de Montfort's administration of secret meetings, hidden weapons caches, and mysterious travelers moving between hostile territories. Most ominously, a new generation of Occitan leaders was emerging to challenge northern domination. Raymond VII of Toulouse, now in his 20s, had spent years in exile, learning from his father's mistakes and building alliances with foreign powers. Unlike Raymond VI, who had been a pragmatic politician seeking accommodation with church authorities, Raymond VII was a dedicated revolutionary, committed to driving out the occupiers regardless of cost. The younger Raymond possessed advantages that his father had lacked. He was unmarried, and thus free from family obligations that might compromise his political flexibility. He had no major territories to defend, and thus could adopt guerrilla tactics without worrying about protecting fixed positions. Most importantly, he embodied a new form of political legitimacy, based not on papal approval or feudal law, but on popular resistance to foreign occupation. Chronicler William of Tudela. The young Count Raymond returned like a flame in the darkness, and wherever he appeared, the people flocked to his banners. They cared nothing for the Pope's excommunications or the king's charters. They wanted only to be ruled by their own lords according to their own customs. The rebellion began in earnest in 1216. When Raymond VII landed on the Mediterranean coast with a small force of exiled nobles and foreign mercenaries, his strategy deliberately avoided the large-scale confrontations that had led to disaster at Muret. Instead, he adopted hit-and-run tactics designed to wear down de Montfort's resources, while demonstrating that northern rule was neither permanent nor secure. The campaign that followed revealed both the strengths and limitations of de Montfort's position. His professional army could defeat any conventional force the rebels could field, but it was too small to garrison every castle and protect every loyal administrator. His political authority was recognized by church and crown, but it lacked the popular legitimacy necessary for effective governance. Castle after castle opened its gates to Raymond VII's forces, not because they were militarily compelled to do so, but because their garrisons and populations welcomed the restoration of traditional authority. Northern French administrators found themselves isolated in hostile territory, dependent entirely on military protection that could not be everywhere at once. Peter of Les Vaux discerned. The Count Simon found himself fighting not an army but a people. Every peasant was a potential spy, every merchant a possible collaborator, every priest suspected of divided loyalties. It was a war without battle lines, where today's friend might be tomorrow's enemy. The psychological warfare was as important as the military campaign. Raymond VII's mere presence in the Languedoc demonstrated that de Montfort's victory was not final, that the old order might yet be restored. Every successful raid, every castle that changed hands, every day that the rebellion survived sent a message to the uncommitted, that perhaps the northern conquerors were not invincible after all. De Montfort's response was characteristically ruthless and ultimately counterproductive. Unable to distinguish between active rebels and passive sympathizers, he increasingly treated the entire population as potentially hostile. Collective punishments, mass deportations, and summary executions became routine tools of administration. The city of Toulouse itself became the focal point of this escalating conflict. In September 1217, Raymond VII attempted to infiltrate the city with a small force of supporters. The plan should have been impossible. Toulouse was heavily garrisoned. Its walls were strong, and its population was under constant surveillance by inquisitors and administrators. But the conspiracy succeeded beyond all expectations. Gates were opened from within, guards were neutralized by their own comrades, and by dawn the city was in rebel hands. The speed and completeness of the operation revealed how hollow de Montfort's authority had become even in his own strongholds. William of Tudela, the joy of the Toulousains when their young count entered the city, was beyond all description. Men wept for happiness, women threw flowers from the windows, and children sang in the streets. It was as if the sun had risen after the longest night in memory. De Montfort's reaction to the loss of Toulouse was swift and decisive. Within weeks, he had assembled an army and laid siege to his former capital. But this siege would be different from his earlier campaigns. Instead of attacking isolated fortresses defended by small garrisons, he was confronting an entire urban population united in resistance to his rule. The siege of Toulouse lasted 9 months and demonstrated the transformation of the Albigensian Crusade from a religious war into a popular revolution. Every citizen of the city, men, women, and children, participated in the defense. Nobles fought alongside craftsmen, priests served with merchants. Grandmothers worked beside granddaughters to repair walls damaged by siege engines. The defenders' motivation was no longer primarily religious. Catholics and former Cathars fought side by side against what they saw as foreign occupation. The issue was not theological orthodoxy, but political independence, not religious purity, but cultural survival. Historian Dr. Joseph Strayer, the siege of Toulouse marked the moment when the Albigensian Crusade ceased to be about heresy and became purely about power. Both sides understood that they were fighting for the future political structure of southern France, not competing interpretations of Christian doctrine. De Montfort's siege techniques. which had been devastatingly effective against isolated castles, proved inadequate against a major city defended by its entire population. His mangonels and trebuchets could damage walls, but the defenders repaired them faster than they could be destroyed. His attempts to cut off supplies were foiled by secret tunnels and sympathetic populations in surrounding territories. Most frustrating of all was his inability to break the defenders' morale. Previous sieges had succeeded when hunger, thirst, or despair had convinced garrisons to surrender. But Toulouse was fighting for its very identity, and its citizens seemed willing to accept any sacrifice rather than submit to renewed occupation. The prolonged siege placed enormous strains on de Montfort's resources and political position. His army consumed supplies at an unsustainable rate while producing no results. His northern French followers, who had joined the crusade expecting quick profits, found themselves trapped in an expensive and apparently endless campaign. His political supporters began to question whether the conquest of the South was worth its enormous cost. By the spring of 1218, de Montfort's situation was becoming desperate. His treasury was empty. His army was shrinking through desertion and expired service obligations. And his political authority was being challenged even by former allies. The man who had seemed invincible just 3 years earlier was facing the collapse of everything he had built. The end came suddenly and dramatically on June 25, 1218, as dawn broke over the siege lines. Defenders on Toulouse's walls launched yet another attack on the Crusaders' siege engines. De Montfort, now 53 years old and worn down by a decade of constant warfare, rode out to assess the damage and direct repairs. What happened next was recorded in the Song of the Cathar Wars, an epic poem that captured both the drama of the moment and its deeper significance. The Song of the Cathar Wars. A stone struck Count Simon on his steel helmet. His eyes, brains, teeth, skull, and jaw were all smashed to pieces, and he fell to the ground, dead, bleeding, and black. The stone that killed the great crusader came from a mangonel operated, according to the chronicler, by the ladies and the women and the girls of Toulouse. The image is almost certainly symbolic rather than literal medieval siege engines. Required considerable strength and training to operate effectively. But the symbolism was perfect. The man who had dominated the Languedoc through superior force had been brought down by the very people he had tried to subjugate. Historian Dr. Malcolm Barber. De Montfort's death was both an accident and an inevitability. The stone that killed him was random, but his position had become untenable. Even if he had survived that morning, he would have faced impossible odds in a war he could no longer win. The psychological impact of de Montfort's death was immediate and overwhelming. For 9 years, he had been the driving force behind the Albigensian Crusade, the man whose personal courage and tactical genius had made northern victory possible. His followers had believed him invincible, protected by divine favor, and destined for ultimate triumph. With his death, that aura of invincibility vanished instantly. The siege of Toulouse collapsed within days as demoralized crusaders abandoned their positions and retreated toward more defensible territories. The great crusading army that had terrorized the south simply melted away, leaving behind only a few isolated garrisons in scattered strongholds. De Montfort's son Amaury inherited his father's titles and claims, but he lacked both the military genius and the religious fanaticism that had made the elder Simon so formidable. A competent but conventional knight, Amaury found himself fighting a kind of war for which his training and temperament were completely unsuited. Historian Dr. Claire Taylor. Amaury de Montfort inherited his father's problems, but not his father's solutions. He was a traditional feudal lord trying to govern through consensus and accommodation. But he was dealing with a population that saw him as a foreign occupier. The tools that worked in normal circumstances were useless in his situation. Within months of his father's death, Amaury was losing territories as rapidly as Simon had once gained them. Castle after castle declared for Raymond VII, not because they were militarily compelled to do so, but because their garrisons and populations welcomed the restoration of legitimate authority. The collapse was so rapid and complete that by 1220, Amaury controlled little beyond the original Trencaval territories around Carcassonne, and the great crusading enterprise that had once seemed destined to reshape southern France had been reduced to a minor, regional lordship maintained only through external military support. The irony was profound and bitter. Simon de Montfort had achieved everything a medieval crusader could hope for: military victory, papal approval, royal recognition, and vast territorial gains. Yet all of it had proven as fragile as morning mist, disappearing the moment his personal force was removed from the equation. Chronicler Peter of Les Vaux discerned. With the Count Simon's death, it seemed as if all the work of the crusade would be undone. The heretics lifted their heads once more. The enemies of the faith took courage, and the faithful began to despair that God had abandoned his chosen people. But the Cistercian chronicler's fears were premature. The death of Simon de Montfort marked not the end of the Albigensian Crusade, but its transformation from a feudal adventure into a royal enterprise. In Paris, King Louis VIII was watching the collapse of the de Montfort's regime with keen interest and carefully laid plans. The stage was now set for the final phase of the Albigensian Crusade. Not a war between competing noble houses, but a conflict between royal France and regional independence. Not a religious crusade, but a campaign of systematic political conquest. The South had won a reprieve, but its ultimate fate was already being decided in the corridors of royal power. Chapter 7. The Last Fortress, on April 12, 1229. In the soaring nave of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Count Raymond VII of Toulouse knelt before the 12-year-old King Louis IX and accepted the most comprehensive surrender in medieval French history. The Treaty of Mauperis, as it came to be known, marked not merely the end of the Albigensian Crusade, but the death of an entire civilization. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of political theater designed to demonstrate the total victory of royal authority over regional independence. Raymond VII, once the most powerful lord in southern France, was stripped of his noble insignia and forced to wear the simple tunic of a penitent. The great nobles of the north watched in silence as their former enemies swore fealty not just to the young king, but to the institutional monarchy that would outlive any individual ruler. Chronicler Matthew Paris: never was there seen such a humiliation of noble pride, nor such a demonstration of royal power. The Count of Toulouse, who had defied popes and emperors, was reduced to begging mercy from a child king. And all who witnessed it understood that the age of feudal independence was ending. The treaty's terms were as comprehensive as they were devastating to southern autonomy. Raymond VII was permitted to retain the title of Count of Toulouse, but more than half of his ancestral domains were ceded directly to the French crown. The remainder would pass to his daughter Joan, who was betrothed to Alphonse of Poitiers, the king's brother. If Joan and Alphonse died without heirs, which is exactly what happened, all remaining territories would revert to the royal domain. But territorial cessions were only the beginning of the treaty's impact. Raymond was required to pay an enormous indemnity of 20,000 marks of silver, a sum so large that it would bankrupt his treasury and prevent him from maintaining the military forces necessary for effective independence. The walls of Toulouse and 30 other major towns were to be dismantled, eliminating the physical infrastructure of potential resistance. Most significantly for the long-term fate of the region, Raymond was obligated to actively hunt down and punish heretics within his remaining territories. He was required to pay bounties for captured perfects, maintain inquisitors at his own expense, and permit unlimited ecclesiastical investigation of his subjects' religious beliefs. Historian Dr. Yves Dosat. The Treaty of Mauperis established the legal framework for the systematic persecution of Catharism. What had previously been irregular crusading violence became institutionalized state terror, administered by professional bureaucrats and justified by legal precedent. The treaty's religious clauses represented the triumph of the new Dominican Inquisition over the older crusading model of anti-heretical warfare, where crusaders had operated through military campaigns that targeted entire communities. Inquisitors worked through judicial procedures that focused on individual beliefs and behaviors. The Dominican Order, founded by the Spanish priest Dominic Guzman during the early years of the Albigensian Crusade, had evolved into the Church's primary weapon against doctrinal deviation. Unlike the Cistercians, who had provided the Crusade's initial leadership, the Dominicans specialized in intellectual combat against heretical ideas rather than military campaigns against heretical territories. The inquisitorial system that emerged in the Languedoc after 1229 was revolutionary in its systematic approach to religious persecution. Professional inquisitors, trained in theology and canon law, established permanent tribunals with standardized procedures for investigating, trying, and punishing suspected heretics. The process was designed to be thorough, impartial, and ultimately inescapable. Inquisitor's Manual. Let the inquisitor proceed with great care and diligence, for he deals not merely with temporal crimes, but with the salvation of souls. Every word must be recorded, every witness examined, every suspected belief investigated to its ultimate source. The inquisitor's methods combined sophisticated interrogation techniques with systematic terror. Suspected heretics were arrested without warning and held incommunicado, while evidence was gathered against them. Family members, servants, and neighbors were pressured to provide testimony, often under threat of being charged as accomplices if they refused to cooperate. The trials themselves followed procedures that made conviction virtually inevitable. The accused were not informed of the specific charges against them or allowed to confront their accusers. Evidence of heretical belief could include almost any deviation from orthodox practice, failure to attend Mass regularly, skepticism about transubstantiation, possession of vernacular religious texts, or association with known heretics. The penalties for conviction ranged from public penance and confiscation of property to imprisonment and execution. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of the inquisitorial system was its use of reconciled heretics as informants against their former coreligionists. Former perfects who had recanted under torture were required to denounce other Cathars as proof of their genuine conversion. Historian Dr. Bernard Gouy. The Inquisition succeeded where the Crusade had failed, because it understood that heresy was ultimately a matter of individual conscience rather than collective rebellion. By targeting beliefs rather than armies, ideas rather than territories, it could root out error wherever it might hide. The systematic persecution that followed the Treaty of Mauperis destroyed the organized Cathar Church within a generation. The elaborate hierarchy of bishops, deacons, and perfects that had once administered sacraments throughout the Languedoc was eliminated through a combination of execution, exile, and forced conversion. But the remnants of the Cathar community did not simply disappear. As the organized church crumbled under inquisitorial pressure, the surviving believers retreated to remote mountain regions where the apparatus of persecution was less effective. The fortress perched on a seemingly inaccessible peak in the Pyrenea foothills became the beating heart of this final resistance. Was more than just a military stronghold, was a symbol of everything the Crusade had failed to destroy. Built on foundations that dated back to Roman times, the fortress had been reconstructed in the early 13th century by Ramon de Perel, a Cathar noble who intended it to serve as a refuge for persecuted believers. The castle's strategic position was extraordinary even by medieval standards. Perched on a rocky outcrop nearly 4,000 feet above sea level, it commanded views across the entire region, while being accessible only by narrow, easily defended paths. The natural defenses were supplemented by walls and towers that took advantage of every feature of the terrain. Archaeologist Drive, Jordi Bolos was designed as the ultimate fortress sanctuary, a place where the Cathar Church could survive even if everything else was lost. Its builders understood that they were creating not just a military position, but a spiritual center that would outlast the persecution. After 1229, became the unofficial capital of the underground Cathar Church. The last Cathar bishop, Bertrand Marty, established his residence there and continued to ordain new prefects despite the mortal danger involved. Pilgrims climbed the treacherous mountain paths to receive the consolamentum, while fugitive nobles found shelter within its walls. The community that developed during the 1230s represented Catharism's final flowering. Cut off from the outside world and facing certain destruction if discovered, the believers created an intensely spiritual society dedicated to prayer, contemplation, and preparation for martyrdom. Daily life within the fortress revolved around religious observances that had been perfected over decades of persecution. The perfects maintained their rigorous ascetic practices, while the credentes participated in simplified versions of Cathar rituals adapted to their dangerous circumstances. The community was remarkably egalitarian, with traditional social hierarchies dissolved in the face of shared danger and common faith. Cathar ritual text, brothers and sisters, we gather in this high place, not in triumph, but in witness. The world below may rage against us, but here we are close to heaven, and from heaven comes our strength. For nearly 15 years after the Treaty of Mauperis, the French royal government tolerated existence. The fortress was remote, apparently impregnable, and posed no immediate threat to established authority. The cost of mounting a siege in such difficult terrain seemed disproportionate to the potential benefits. But the massacre of inquisitors at Avignonet in May 1242 changed the political calculus dramatically. A group of Cathar militants, operating from Cadamache, killed 11 members of an inquisitorial tribunal, including 2 Dominican inquisitors. The attack was not just murder, but symbolic rebellion against the entire system of religious persecution. Inquisitor William Arnold's final letter, "We go among these heretics as sheep among wolves, trusting in God's protection and the righteousness of our cause. If we should perish in this service, let our blood be the seed of orthodoxy in this rebellious land." The royal response was swift and decisive. King Louis IX, now ruling in his own right, authorized a massive military expedition to destroy and eliminate the last vestiges of organized Catharism. The army that assembled in the spring of 1243 numbered over 10,000 men, and included the most sophisticated siege equipment available to medieval warfare. The siege of that began in May 1243 was unlike any previous operation in the Albigensian Crusade. This was not a campaign to conquer territory or convert populations, but a focused effort to eliminate a specific threat to royal and ecclesiastical authority. The besiegers understood that they were witnessing the final act of a drama that had begun more than 30 years earlier. Siege chronicler Brother Bernard: "The army of the king surrounded the mountain like a great serpent, cutting off all escape while the engines of war were hauled up paths that seemed impossible for men to climb." Yet such was the determination to end this heresy that no obstacle seemed too great. The technical challenges of besieging were enormous. Traditional siege engines had to be disassembled and carried piece by piece up narrow mountain trails, then reassembled in positions where they could effectively target the fortress walls. Supply lines stretched for dozens of miles through hostile territory, where every peasant might be a Cathar sympathizer. The defenders, numbering fewer than 400 people, including non-combatants, faced impossible odds but fought with the courage of those who had nothing left to lose. They understood that surrender meant not just death, but the Albigensian Crusade.